Today's webinar is being presented by Claire Schutte, our staff psychologist at the Johnson Center for Child Health and Development. She graduated with honors from the University of Florida with the Bachelor of Science in Psychology and a minor in General Education. She completed graduate training at Florida Institute of Technology, completing a doctoral degree in clinical psychology and a master's degree in applied behavioral analysis. Dr. Schutte has treated a diverse population of children, adolescents, and adults in a variety of clinical settings, including community clinics, college counseling centers, psychiatric hospitals, private practice, and private treatment programs. She has extensive experience in the area of child and adult psychological evaluation and assessment, and recently completed a postdoctoral residency in psychological evaluation. Her graduate training led Dr. Schutte to discover an interest in helping individuals with autism and developmental disorders. She has provided individual therapy, group therapy, and social skills training to individuals on the autism spectrum, and is excited to continue helping those with autism and related disorders by providing psychological evaluations at the Johnson Center. Before we begin the presentation, please note that questions can be typed into your control panel throughout the presentation, and time permitting, they will be addressed at the end. Also, for those of you that have requested copies of this presentation, we cannot send out the presenter's slides. However, we do post recordings of all of our free webinars on the Johnson Center YouTube channel. Please search for us on YouTube and subscribe to get full access to all of our recorded webinars. Now please welcome Dr. Claire Schutte.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. I'm looking forward to talking with you over the next hour or so about independent living. This is the second part of a four-part series we're doing on transitions for adolescents and young adults with autism spectrum disorders. A quick overview of what I'm going to be covering today. Again, this topic today is on independent living, and I'm going to be talking about the types of independent living skills and behaviors, assessment of independent living skills, different teaching strategies that you can use to teach independent living skills, as well as important areas to plan for and consider when transition planning for adolescents and young adults with autism. Make sure to stay tuned for the next two parts of this series. Part 3 is going to be in October, and that's going to be covering social relationships related to transitions. So it'll be everything from peer relationships, romantic relationships, work relationships, relationships within post-secondary education. So it'll be covering a wide range of different relationship issues that young adults might face. And part 4 is going to be in November, and I'm going to be talking about higher education and jobs and different vocational type issues. So make sure to stay tuned for those. The first part of this series was an overview, and in the beginning I asked that people tuning in for it, if there are any specific issues or topics that you'd like to hear more about that are related to part 3 and part 4, so social relationships or higher education, feel free to type in the question section certain areas that you would like guidance with, and I'll do my best to cover that during part 3 and part 4 of the series. As Nisi mentioned, we're going to be providing a certificate of attendance if you need that for this webinar. Here's a quick link that you can go to, and I'll also be showing this at the end of the presentation today if you do need to obtain a certificate of attendance. So a quick recap from part 1, which again was the overview of transition and transition planning for adolescents and young adults with autism. We talked about certain laws and state-funded services that can help with transitions. I'm not going to go over these again in detail. However, I have provided a good resource at the bottom if you would like more details. But we talked about the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act and how that relates to transition planning when an individual is in a public high school setting. We talked about the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Vocational Rehabilitation Act, and Section 504. We talked about vocational rehab as one of the agencies that can help with transitions, as well as the Administration on Developmental Disabilities. These are just a few of those that we did talk about during the overview. If you do want to touch up on these or get more details, a great resource is The Life Journey Through Autism. This is a publication by the Organization for Autism Research, Dania International. I'll have a link to the specific reference at the end of this presentation, but you can go to this link here, and at the end of the publication there's a great appendix there that I liked, that outlines these specific laws and kind of gives you a visual of what the differences are between them. We also talked about during the overview that support for transitions is often provided by a range of different individuals. Parents of adolescents and young adults often play a primary role in the transition process, as well as teachers, therapists, different agencies, etc. An important point that was mentioned is that transition planning should begin early, really around age 14 or so. And as part of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, transition services and planning must be provided by the public school. So that was another important point from part one, the overview that we covered. So now we're going to move into talking about independent living skills. So what are independent living skills? These are skills and behaviors that are often referred to as adaptive behavior, life skills, or living skills. And basically they're behaviors that help individuals live independently and function safely and appropriately in daily life. Independent living skills, they emphasize development of independence, and they also relate to quality of life of the individual. So here's just some examples of independent living skills or behaviors. Things like hygiene and hygiene-related behaviors such as showering, wearing deodorant, hygiene routines, residential and home management, so everything from cooking and cleaning the apartment or home, nutrition-related skills, cooking, budgeting, keeping track of money, using money, cleaning, transportation skills, daily planning and organization, leisure activities and behaviors, and community involvement. These are all examples of independent living skills and behaviors. Towards the end of the presentation, I'm going to be going into more detail about areas to consider within many of these examples. Next, I'd like to talk about assessment and intervention planning related to independent living. So during transition planning, again, this should start early, typically around the age of 14 or so. Independent living skills of the individual should be assessed so that you can adequately plan for intervention and for the individual's transition plan, and create a plan to teach areas of need within the area of independent living before the individual transitions. So you want to be as proactive as possible and identify areas of need before the individual has actively transitioned. So assessment of independent living skills can help you identify what areas need to be taught, what intervention is needed, kind of a profile of the individual's strengths and weaknesses related to independent living. Assessment helps greatly with treatment planning. And it can also help measure progress towards goals. So an initial assessment of independent living skills, it's going to give you a baseline of what the individual is coming in with in terms of their skills and in terms of what they need support with. And further assessments will help identify where they're making progress and where continued needs might lie. So assessment really plays an important role in program planning for independent living skills. So I wanted to share just some examples of different assessment instruments that are out there that can help with assessment of independent living skills. The first one is the Ansel-Casey Life Skills Assessment. This can be used for ages 14 to 21, and it covers related areas such as career planning, communication, daily living, home life, housing, money management, self-care, social relationships, work life, and work study skills. So it really covers a broad range of independent living skill type behaviors as well as helpful transition areas. It can be completed either by the individual or the caregiver. The Vineland Adaptive Behavior Scales is another popular adaptive behavior or kind of life skills assessment. It covers a more wide range of ages from toddlers to adults. And it covers the general areas of communication, daily living skills, socialization, and motor skills. It's typically completed by a caregiver, and it's a norm-referenced assessment, so it compares the individual's scores with those of other individuals their same age to see if they're performing on average with a norm group above or below. And then the Brigance Transition Skills Inventory is another assessment that can be used for looking at independent living skills. It can be used for individuals in the 8th grade up to adulthood, and it looks into areas including math skills, money, technology, housing, food, transportation, health, and community resources, as well as additional employment-related skills. So this one kind of combines employment skills and independent living skills, which are both important within transition planning. It can be completed by the student or young adult, and it's a criterion referenced assessment, which means it assesses whether or not an individual is meeting a particular skill criterion or level. So all of these can be really helpful in terms of getting a better idea of what the individual skills and areas of need are. And it's important to remember that you don't want to rely just on one of these assessments or one source of data. You really want to collect information on the individual skills from multiple sources. So from the parent, from teachers, from one of these assessment measures or two of them, as well as maybe observation, for example. So once you're done with the assessment process, you want to create an intervention plan. And you want to consider the unique needs of the adolescent and the adult. As we talked about during the overview of this series, it's important as much as possible to involve the individual and to use a person-centered approach. So you want to talk to the adolescent or young adult about what their hopes and goals are as well. You want to consider the overall or general transition plan. And you want to create an intervention plan for teaching the necessary independent living skills and identify what support is needed to teach these skills. As part of the intervention plan, you want to make sure to include short-term and long-term goals. So you want to identify what short-term goals are going to help meet those long-term goals. You want to make sure that the goals that you're identifying are clearly defined and whenever possible that they're measurable so that change can be identified and measured. Again, you want to involve the individual and their primary support team, identify who will be teaching the different skills, indicate the level of support needed, and define how progress towards the goals will be measured and assessed, and identify any challenging behaviors that could create barriers to meeting these goals or to independent living in general. So, for example, things like behavioral rituals, aggression, elopement, things that could get in the way of the individual meeting their goals. So here's some examples of goals that relate to independent living and how they might be written. By the end of this school year, Tim will be able to use the public transportation system independently to and from school and his work shadowing program with 80% success. So this is a very specific goal, and it identifies something that you can measure with 80% success. A bad example would be simply stating, Tim will use the bus independently. That doesn't give us that many specifics. Here's another example. Upon graduation, Sarah will increase her hours working at the library from 5 hours per week to 10 hours per week with support provided through vocational rehabilitation. So again, you're looking for something specific, increasing from 5 to 10 hours per week. Upon graduation, you have a time limit there. A bad example would be something more general, like Sarah will work with vocational rehabilitation to secure employment after graduation. This isn't as specifically defined as this example is up here. A few more examples of goals. Every Friday, Tim will independently prepare his grocery list following his grocery checklist. Or Linda will independently cook dinner 4 days per week using at least 3 different recipes in her recipe binder. So these examples, they give you a sense of the importance of making goals as specific as possible, and whenever possible, making sure that they can be measured so that progress can be monitored. Now I'm going to move us into different strategies that can be used to teach independent living skills. And then after this, I'll be talking about specific areas of independent living skills that should be considered. So in general, I know I've emphasized this a lot, but it's important to be proactive and to start early when teaching these skills before the individual transitions and then during the transition process. It's always useful to use multiple forms of presenting information. So you don't want to just present information orally. You want to use, whenever possible, multiple sources of presentation, such as using visual aids or modeling the skill that you're trying to teach. As much as possible, you want to present the information in simple, clear-cut, and factual ways. It's also very important to program for generalization and to probe whether or not generalization is happening. And generalization, it means basically the skill generalizing from a teaching setting to the real environment or across environments that you want it to be performed in. So again, you don't want to just teach how to write a check in a classroom environment. You want to make sure that the individual, that learning is transferring to the real life environment. So if you're teaching how to write a check, making sure that they can do it at the grocery store or wherever they might need to write a check. It's useful as well to include multiple support people. So utilizing a mentor or a coach, such as a job coach, a shadow, or a therapist when teaching these different skills. Applied behavior analysis techniques can be very useful and successful in teaching independent living skills. So some examples of ABA techniques that I'm going to be reviewing today are right here. Task analysis, chaining, shaping, reinforcement, self-monitoring, social stories, modeling, and using visual cues and schedules. All of these are great teaching strategies that can be used to teach independent living skills. So task analysis, basically what task analysis is you're breaking down a full task into manageable chunks. So for example, the task of brushing teeth. A task analysis might look something like this. You're breaking it down into really specific steps. And you can be as specific as possible based on what the individual's needs are. So this one does break down brushing teeth into pretty small steps. So get your toothbrush case, unzip the case, take out toothpaste, unscrew the toothpaste cap, lay the cap on the counter, etc. And so this would keep going until the whole task of brushing teeth was covered. Again, task analysis, it's basically just breaking down a larger task into more manageable chunks. Chaining is another strategy that can be used. It's somewhat similar to task analysis, but it involves providing reinforcement upon successive steps. So with chaining as well, you're breaking down a more complex process into smaller responses, or breaking it down into more manageable chunks. So when all of the smaller steps are performed together, it leads to whatever target behavior or task you're trying to teach. Each step in the chaining process is cumulative, and the child, adolescent, or adult will receive reinforcement following the cumulative steps. So chaining, again, it helps break down the tasks. There's different types of chaining that I'm not going to get into too much detail about, but they're either done in a forward manner, so moving from the beginning to the end, in a backward manner, so starting with the end product and going back through the steps, or total task, which is presenting everything all at once. So an example of a chaining procedure, you might teach how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. So the first step would be to take out the bread. The second step would be take out the peanut butter and jelly and the knife. Then the third step might be to spread the peanut butter on, for example. So with chaining, you're going to be providing some type of reinforcement upon successful completion of each step. So again, chaining can help break down more complex steps into smaller steps, and it uses reinforcement to teach the skill or the total task. Shaping is another teaching strategy that can be used. It's similar to chaining in some ways, but the response that you're looking for teaching is taught by rewarding successive approximations to the response. So you're providing reinforcement when the individual is kind of getting close to the response that you're looking for. So if you're teaching brushing hair, for example, you might first work on holding the brush just towards the individual's head and providing reinforcement for it just getting close to the head. The next approximation might be putting the brush on the head, then putting the brush with the bristles on the head, and then brushing through the hair. So again, you're reinforcing steps that kind of get you closer to the behavior that you're looking for, but they're more approximations to the response that you're reinforcing. Self-monitoring is another great strategy when teaching independent living skills. And basically the individual is taught strategies to monitor and track their own work. Most of us use different self-monitoring strategies ourselves. For example, I'm a big list maker, and I love crossing through my to-do list as I complete each task. That's an example, or a basic example, of self-monitoring. So you're using things like charts, grids, checklists, any type of list. Some examples of what self-monitoring might look like is an individual might have a grid, a paper with a grid on it, and every time they complete a task, they mark an X in a box. So it might be for a specific task, or it could be any task that they're supposed to complete. And they're just putting X's, and then their supervisor might review how many X's they get, or it might just be for them to review. Another example might be at particular time intervals, the individual makes a mark. So they might set an alarm on their phone. So every 30 minutes, they assess whether they completed a task. Or it might be more self-monitoring whether or not they're on task and completing the task that they're supposed to be working on. And then another simple example of self-monitoring would be just using a basic checklist, and the student checks off when they complete a certain task that's on that checklist. So you can use self-monitoring in a lot of different ways, and it can be helpful for the individual to kind of track and be aware of what progress they're making. Visual aids and cues are also very helpful for teaching independent living skills. So it can be anything from a visual chart to using a calendar that's posted up on the wall, using visual schedules, using actual pictures in different ways. So some examples would be using a picture schedule of each step of washing hands, or each step of boiling water. Another example would be using pictures as a grocery list. So instead of having words, you might have words and pictures, for example. Another example of using visual aids or cues is a picture is presented before each transition. So before the individual transitions from work to lunch break, a picture of lunch might be put up 5 minutes before the transition to lunch is going to occur, so that it can help kind of prompt before the transition occurs. And then at the last 5 minutes of lunch, a picture of work, something related to work, might be held up or posted so that that can kind of prompt the individual for the transition back to work time. Social stories are another example of kind of a visual that can be used. These were developed by Carol Gray, and basically social stories, they describe a situation, a skill, or concept in terms of what social cues are relevant, perspectives, and common responses. And social stories are done in a specifically defined style and format. The Social Stories website is a great resource. You can go to thegraycenter.org. That's where I got this definition here. And basically, in so many words, a social story is a type of visual script. So it kind of walks you through a visual. And it might be related to a social situation or a task. But social stories can also be great in terms of teaching independent living skills. So here's a quick example of a hand washing visual. As you can see, it kind of breaks down the task. This is like a task analysis, breaking down hand washing into specific steps and providing visuals of each step. So washing hands involves turning on the water, getting soap, washing hands, turning off the water, and then drying hands. I'm going to show you a quick example of what a visual schedule of cleaning the room might look like. Let's see. So as you can see, again, the task of cleaning the bedroom is broken down. This one has words for each step as well as pictures. Making the bed, picking up, putting away clean clothes. So you can define everything that should be included for the individual as part of a cleaning their bedroom routine, and include pictures for that. In this example I got from the Autism Spectrum Directory, and here's the link right here. Modeling is another great strategy for teaching independent living skills, and basically that's when someone models the task and how to do it for the individual. So it can be in-person modeling, or it could also be modeling on a video. So someone on a video shows and models how to do a particular task. So you might model for a young adult how to use a credit card and a swipe machine at the grocery store, or model for them how to buy and use a bus card, or how to tie a tie. So actually showing them how to do these things. And just a quick note on these teaching strategies, these are just some examples that can be helpful. And when teaching independent living skills, oftentimes you're going to want to combine many of these teaching strategies and figure out what works best for the individual and come up with more of an individualized teaching strategy based on how they seem to learn the best. So you might use something like modeling and a visual schedule to teach a certain task. So again, you don't want to just rely on one of these methods, but you want to combine as many as you can. So I wanted to touch a little bit on managing challenging behaviors that could interfere with learning independent living skills. When there are any challenging or maladaptive behaviors that might come in the way of learning, it's important to come up with a behavior plan of how you can manage those behaviors. And part of that behavior plan, you want to define the behavior goals and targets. So what behavior do you want to decrease? And what might be an appropriate replacement behavior for that challenging behavior? And you want to make sure that you're defining these behaviors as specifically as possible so that they can be observed and measured. You want to do your best to determine the purpose or the function of the behavior so that you can adequately target it in an intervention plan and decrease it. So just a quick example, let's look at the example of this individual verbally recites movie lines when they're in public places, and it's attracting some negative attention and can be distracting. So the goals might be simply to decrease the verbally reciting movie lines when in public places. And a more appropriate behavior might be to teach the individual to verbally recite their movie lines during certain scheduled times or in private. So you want to identify what the function of the behavior is and what things might trigger the behavior. So for this example, it was found that when demands were placed for the individual, their reciting of movie lines increased, and he was often allowed to escape the situation. So the behavior was escape maintained because, you know, when they would recite the movie lines, then they get to leave the situation. So a basic intervention plan, some examples of what might be included would be don't allow him to escape when the demands are placed. Provide reinforcement if the behavior you're trying to decrease doesn't happen, and create a scheduled time when they're allowed to recite the movie lines and reinforce appropriate use of this schedule. So again, you want to consider the skills that you want to teach the individual in the area of independent living, as well as, you know, come up with a behavior plan if there are any challenging behaviors that might create barriers to learning or barriers to successful independent living skills. So for the last part of the presentation, I'm going to be going through some specific areas to consider when you're coming up with a transition plan. in the area of independent living. So the first broad area is personal care. Some examples of things to consider within this area are general health and wellness, nutrition-related behaviors and learning, so understanding what balanced eating is, making smart nutritional choices, making choices when eating out, exercise, so figuring out an exercise routine, what exercise is most enjoyable for the individual. It might include medication management, so everything from reminders to take medication to schedules, keeping track of what medication is what, planning and getting to personal appointments, self-advocacy skills, so voicing when the individual is feeling sick or might need to see a doctor, what to do when they get sick, having plans for when accidents occur, hygiene-related behaviors, so everything from shaving to showering, deodorant use, menstrual care, clothing, so for example, picking out clothes, dressing for appropriately for the weather, cleanliness of clothes. An example of clothing, when I worked with young adults with Asperger's, there was a young man I worked with who loved a certain sports team, and he wanted to always wear a particular jersey every day. And we had to work with him on making sure that the jersey was clean and, you know, what days to wear the jersey and what settings it might be most appropriate for. Sleep is another big issue within the area of personal care. So teaching sleep hygiene skills, which would be things like prepping for bed, doing activities that help the individual wind down and fall asleep. Video games can be very popular, being on the computer before bed. However, that has been shown to be kind of more stimulating. So with some students or young adults, you have to work on shutting off the computer as part of a sleep hygiene routine. Stress management behaviors are also important to cover, sexual health and safety, and psychological health. These are all important areas within the area of personal care to make sure you're covering within a transition plan for independent living. Daily living skills. Some examples of those would be things like using a telephone, using a phone directory, making calls, appropriately answering phone calls, cooking behaviors, so knowing how to use appliances in the kitchen, to following a recipe, knowing what utensils and supplies might be needed, understanding portions or measuring for recipes. Grocery shopping, so making lists, navigating the store, learning how to check out at a store, staying within budget. A lot of these general areas really can include a lot of different skills and understanding that's necessary when you really think about them. So something that seems kind of basic like grocery shopping really isn't that simple, and it involves a lot of knowledge and strategies that need to be taught based on the individual's needs. Another important area is handling money and budgeting skills. So everything from counting and making change to knowing how to use the bank, using credit cards, internet shopping, paying bills. You want to look out for any excessive spending or excessive saving. It can be helpful to find a bank and a banker who the young adult might be able to build a connection with and see, you know, every time they go to the bank so that they can have a go-to person there. Transportation is also important within the area of daily living. So everything from safe street crossing to driving if the individual drives, as well as learning and using public transportation. Laundry is also important, and cleaning, keeping up their room or their house or residential area. Um, and so things like for cleaning and laundry, you want to think about the who, what, when, wheres, and hows. So what do they have to clean? When do they do it? How do they do it? And where do they do it? And again, for all of these, you want to use some of those strategies that we talked about earlier. So something like cleaning, a task analysis, or chaining might be a useful strategy paired with a visual schedule, for example. Some safety skills that are very important to cover, again, are things like transportation and crossing the street, interacting with strangers, understanding who they can give money to, physical and sexual safety, as well as kind of what to do during an illness or injury. Having a plan for emergencies, understanding how and when to report situations that might have been unsafe or uncomfortable for the individual, as well as residential safety issues. So things like what to do in the case of a fire, or if their fire alarm goes out, or how to use a fire extinguisher. And these are just some of the examples of safety-related behaviors and areas that should be considered. And again, you want to consider the individual and what safety skills they might need to learn based on their individual transition plan and what's going to be involved in that. Leisure is another important area within the area of independent living. It's important to help the individual develop leisure activities and a leisure schedule. This is important for their quality of life. So you want to kind of consider the individual's hobbies, what they're interested in. You want to make sure to teach how to schedule leisure activities and time management. Leisure activities can easily kind of take over, and you want to make sure the individual isn't reading books so much that they're missing their class or not studying. So you want to help teach balance and when the leisure activities should take place. They might involve social opportunities. It can be helpful to involve the individual's special interests in their leisure activities, and it might also include things like day trips or exploring the community or different places to go within their area. And then community participation is also important to consider in program planning. So you want to make sure, again, to base how much community participation is needed on the individual's preferences and what their needs are. But it might include getting the individual to participate in different community events, helping them access different support services in the community or different public facilities, such as parks they might enjoy going to local YMCA, different community social events that might be enjoyable, religious events, as well as exercise. Executive functioning skills are a type of skills that are highly important for independent living and life skills. Basically, what executive functioning skills are processes that help us with planning and organization and time management. So kind of our abilities to be a planner and a scheduler in so many words. So when you're teaching executive functioning skills, you want to first see, again, what skills the individual is coming up with, what they're good at, and then based on what their needs are, you might use different strategies, such as teaching the individual how to use a weekly planner, um, and using a planner, for example, if they're in school, what they need to put in the planner, how to use it. Phones can be great for different time management type skills, so using the phone um, for different reminders. You can also use visual cues can be very helpful for executive functioning skills. So putting a visual schedule on the refrigerator, using a post-it on the back of the door to help remind the individual that they need to grab their lunch before they leave the door, or making different lists. So it's important to make sure that you're looking into what needs the young adult might have with executive functioning, because these can really impact success of independent living skills. So the last topic I'd like to cover are just things to consider with residential arrangements and transitioning. So when you're considering what type of residential arrangement would be best, you first have to consider the type of home that might be most appropriate. For a lot of individuals, this might be continuing to live at the parents' home. It could be more of a dorm or shared living type setting, a group home, living independently on their own with certain supports, a residential program or state facility, or a supervised apartment. These are just some examples of the different types of housing arrangements that you might be considering. You also want to look into the location of the housing, and you want to look into things like how close is it to parents and family or other support services. Does it need to be close to the college or the school that the individual is attending, or does it need to be close to their job? What available transportation is close by and accessible? Is the housing near the grocery store, or the pharmacy, or other necessities? The level of support is also important to assess. So you're assessing the type of home and also the level of support that's needed for that. So it might be full-time care, so something more like an inpatient residential setting where full-time care is available. Another example might be support that's just provided through the individual's school. So for example, from the residential assistants in the dorm, or extra support from the Office of Disability Services. Or it might be related to more supported living, such as a more group home style support where there is some level of independence but also supervision. So again, everyone's level of support that is needed is going to be different, and you want to consider what's best for the individual. Here are some questions that can be helpful to ask when considering different residential arrangements. So do the residents make their own decisions and choices? What's the management style of the housing? Are levels of support based on the individual's needs or on all of the residents? What are the needs of the other residents, and kind of how do these compare to my young adult's needs? Can you individualize the living space? What are the policies and house rules? Is transportation available or included as part of the setup? Do they provide support in teaching skills? Are leisure group outings requirements? And even if your young adult is going to be living at home, these are important things to think about when you're helping them transition to more independent living, even if it's still at the parent's home. So basically you can come up, it might not be a one-size-fits-all residential arrangement, and this isn't, that's not really available. A lot of residential arrangements, you have to kind of individualize them to what the young adult needs. So here's some examples of how you might individualize the housing arrangements. So a young adult might live at home but have certain supports, for example, from a voc rehab person or a job coach or mentor, and have specific responsibilities. They might have to pay a small portion towards their living expenses. Another example might be that the individual lives independently with extra support from their family, from therapists, and or residential assistants. An individual might live with roommates with support from a therapist who helps them with meal planning, shopping, and money management. Another individual might might live in more of a full service setting, so more of an inpatient setting where support and services provided for almost everything. So again, you want to create something that's individualized if needed. So that brings us to the end of the presentation today, and I'd just like to review some resources and references that can be helpful in the area of independent living as well as transitions in general for young adults. And then hopefully we'll have time for a question or two at the end here. So here's a few websites that I found were useful: the Transition Coalition, the Ohio Center for Autism and Low Incidence, the National Secondary Transition Technical Assistance Center, Roadmap to the Future, Transitioning to Young Adulthood with Autism Spectrum Disorders, the Texas Guide for Effective Teaching, Transition, and Vocational Assessment. This one had a listing of different transition type assessments that was helpful. The National Dissemination Center for Children with Disabilities, they have a Transition to Adulthood page that can be found here. The National Secondary Transition Technical Assistance Center. There's an Autism Speaks Adult Service page. They also have a transition toolkit that's helpful. These are two books that are great: the Autism Transition Guide, Planning the Journey from School to Adult Life, as well as Autism in the Transition to Adulthood, Success Beyond the Classroom. I really like this last one here. And here's some different guides that can be helpful as well. Transition to Adulthood Guidelines for Individuals with Autism Spectrum Disorders, as well as Life Journey Through Autism. And then Rights Law can be helpful in terms of understanding different educational laws, particularly how the IDEA relates to transition planning for young adults. And then here are my references here. So what I'm going to do is review questions that were submitted, and then hopefully we'll have time, it looks like, for at least one or maybe two of those. But real quick, if you do need a certificate of this presentation, here's a link that you can go to do so. And then make sure to follow the Johnson Center. We keep our website, Facebook page updated with events and webinars that can be helpful. If you would like to review this webinar again, we post our webinars on the Johnson Center YouTube channel, which is the first link up here. Okay, now I'm just going to take a moment to review the questions, so bear with me.